So I was asked to talk about the legalities of the EAC with a closer look at Somalia. So I will not go into the definitions because I think the previous speakers today and yesterday went through all this, and many of you, by virtue of your attendance here, you have an idea as to what it takes to be an EAC member state. So, who is an EAC member state? That is covered in Article 3 of the EAC Treaty. I will not go into that. But I think the most important thing is, why should Somalia join the EAC, or why is Somalia's entrance into the East African community significant? I think that's what I want to focus the basis of my presentation today. So, I know Somalia is a country of pastoralists. I happen to be one, and we love telling stories. And I think stories convey deeper meaning and help people appreciate complex issues better than PowerPoints would. So, as I said, I'll not go through Article 3. It outlines who a member state is. But I want to talk about the history of Somalia and East Africa. As you may well know, I don't know if the organizers announced, I come from Uganda, but the last 2 days I have been in transit, whether it's in Nairobi or here. Whenever I've been at a check-in desk and I mention that I'm going to Somalia, someone speaks to me in Somali. So if you're looking for reason number one why Somalia should join the East African community, I've given you just one. But on a more serious note, I was first introduced to Somalia by a Somali writer called Nuruddin Farah. Now, I know Farah hasn't lived in this country for a long time, but through his novels, he depicts the history of Somalia, the culture, the people, and I think in reading his works, I got to understand or to have a vivid description of what makes Somalia tick and what makes the Somali diaspora one of the most vibrant, not only in our region, but also, I think I can comfortably say, in the world. Now, Nuruddin Farah, as you might well know, lived a part of his life in Uganda. He was teaching at our main university, Makerere, in the 90s. So writing in 2010, following the unfortunate Kampala bombings that killed over 70 Ugandans, Farah recounted an earlier meeting with President Yoweri Museveni in the 1990s. And to quote him, he says he approached a friend of his who was then a minister in the government with a suggestion to, quote unquote, take my peace proposal for Somalia to President Museveni, who at that time was chairperson of the Organization of African Unity, the precursor to the AU. And Farah says that Somalia, I was pleased, was top of the OAU chairman Museveni's agenda. This is around 1990. Of course, the engagement did not go so well because following a series of meetings between members of the Somali diaspora in Uganda and outside Uganda, their efforts did not succeed. And I think Nuruddin made the mistake of airing his frustration publicly to a BBC correspondent that President Museveni had been a letdown. And this resulted into his expulsion from Makerere, and he left Uganda at that time. Of course, writing in 2010, Farah seems to have warmed up to President Museveni because a lot had changed, and he described the Ugandan leader then as being steadfast in his unflinching support to Somalia. Why do I tell that story? Because whenever we talk about Somalia, whether it's its entrance to the East African community or the recent challenges that the country has had, oftentimes we ignore the agency of Somalis themselves, both in the country and outside the country. And I think at every critical juncture, Somalis have been very critical in shaping the direction of their country's interaction with the region. The second story I want to tell is one that is close to my heart, and it involves someone who is in this room. That is my friend and a fellow of the Leo Africa Institute in Uganda, where I happen to be deputy director, and that is a gentleman called Mohamed Okash. Mohamed is somewhere in the audience. He's one of the organizers of this conference. So in 2017, my organization launched a regional fellowship program called the Young and Emerging Leaders Project. And our aim was to identify promising young, as the name suggests, young and emerging leaders in our region. And we received applications from a number of countries, but our focus, and I think it was even clear in the application, is that this program is for East Africans. So we're looking at Kenyans, Ugandans, Tanzanians, Rwandans, and Burundians at that time. Around that time, Okash was studying at a university in Kampala. He was doing his master's, and he applied for the program. So the program would request you to identify where you come from or which country you're a citizen. So Okash said he was from Somalia, and we rejected his application. This was in 2018. The next year, we put out the second call, and Okash still applied. And now we could not just reject his application. We needed to sit and confer. So when we sat to review his application, and Okash, I've never told you this story. So when we sat to review the application, we had to ask ourselves, under what criteria would we reject this application? True, this was an applicant from Somalia, which was not a member of the EAC at the time, but everything on his CV made him the ideal candidate for the program. He had been the coordinator of an international class of over 52 graduate students at Kampala International University. He had been a Minister of International Affairs and Foreign Relations of Kampala International University Students' Union, among so many other achievements that put him far beyond his peers. Confronted with this dilemma, ladies and gentlemen, we were forced to amend the rules and admit Okash in the 2019 Young and Emerging Leaders Project class, where 10 months later, he emerged as the class valedictorian. So when a few months ago, Somalia was admitted into the EAC, I wanted to call up someone at Arusha. My friend is seated in the audience there. He sits at the Secretariat. I wanted to call someone up at Arusha and tell them that actually my organization, the Leo Africa Institute, had adopted Somalia years before the East African community had done. And I think this is testament to what role civil society can play in deepening integration, and it affirms further the truth or the statement that integration ultimately is about people. It's not about the laws, the rules, and that's why I skipped the treaty or the approach that the presenters had requested me to make. So, still on Okash, I'm glad to report that following his time in the fellowship, of course after we had amended the rules, we couldn't go back. So Somali applicants who applied for the classes that followed would have to be adopted based on that precedent. But I must report that Okash has been instrumental in expanding our institute work and our network here in Somalia, where following his admission, 2009 would be 5 years ago, we now have, and I'm happy to report, 4 fellows of the Leo Africa Institute from Somalia, working in various sectors in this country. Some of them are working with government, others in the private sector, and some of them in your institutions of higher learning. I find these to be brilliant, energetic young people who are committed to rebuilding their country, Somalia, and to sharing this experience with their regional peers through programs like ours. Today, thanks to the addition of Somalia, the East African Community Center of Gravity, I don't know if you can look at that map. Those of you who did elementary physics in high school, you remember a formula for determining the center of gravity of an irregular object, put it on a string. So if you held our East African community on the string, its center of gravity is moving further eastwards and northwards to somewhere, I believe, that is between eastern Uganda or western Kenya. And what initially started out as an East and Central African affair, as you can see with the original member states, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and then Rwanda and Burundi, we seem to be shifting towards Central Africa. But I think with the addition of Somalia, what initially started as an East Central African affair is slowly gravitating into what you would consider a greater East and Horn of Africa community of 9 member states. I know countries like Ethiopia have expressed interest in joining the community. This will further strengthen the move eastwards and northwards into the Horn of Africa. As I come to a close, why do I bring up these 2 stories? They underscore the resilience and contributions of Somalia's people towards shaping the direction of their country over the last 3 or so decades ago. Many observers who look at Somalia today find Somalia's problems or define Somalia's problems as intractable and suggest that solutions to these can only possibly come from outside. And eager to prefer these quick solutions and sometimes lacking proper context of the country's problems, they resort to argument by analogy. I don't know if members in the audience are familiar with argument by analogy. Argument by analogy is where you look at 2 similar situations that are alike, and then you make a conclusion that certainly one should lead to the other. And I'm sure you've heard of comments like Somalia is another Afghanistan in the waiting, and that upon the exit of foreign forces, it's unlikely the center in Somalia will hold. I disagree with such assessments because I think rather than focus on what the world and the region can offer Somalia to overcome her challenges, we ought to discuss what Somalia can give in terms of lessons for the region. And these lessons can be drawn from its rich history and recent experience as a post-conflict society. And here again, I'll revert to some examples from history. Somalia, over 60 years ago, showed us and the whole continent that a president in Africa can be defeated in a free and fair election and hand over power peacefully. This following the defeat of President Aden Ade in 1967. And this election defeat, or I don't know how you look at it, whether it was election defeat on the side of President Ade or election win on the side of the gentleman who replaced him, made significant history for Africa because it was the first time that power was transitioning democratically from one elected leader to another, for the first time in Africa outside of Liberia. I'm sure many people confronted with Somalia's issues today do not remember this history. The other example I want to highlight is Somalia's stance with the rest of Africa. Somalia stood shoulder to shoulder with progressive Africans fighting foreign domination or dictatorships by fellow Africans, as was the case in Uganda under President Idi Amin, where Somalia's president then, President Siad Barre, offered support to Ugandan exiles like President Yoweri Museveni. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I don't know if you know this, but when he was fighting Idi Amin, President Yoweri Museveni at the time was carrying a Somali passport that was given to him by this country. And the picture you can see there is President Siad Barre mediating between the Foreign Minister of Tanzania and the Foreign Minister of Uganda, something that I'll talk about a bit later. Somalia not only provided support to Ugandan exiles, the country also supported other struggles on the continent, prominent amongst which was the support to the African National Congress while they fought white minority rule in South Africa. Example number 3 is how Somalia saved the East African community. I know, must be wondering, it wasn't a member, how did it save the East African community? In 1972, with Tanzania and Uganda, who are members of the original East African community, almost pushed to war amongst each other, President Siad Barre mediated between the two countries, and following Somalia's intervention through the Mogadishu Accord of 1972 that was signed between Tanzania and Uganda, the event that is highlighted in the picture there. This is a New York Times article from 1972 talking about the historic signing in Mogadishu of the Mogadishu Accord between Uganda and Tanzania that forestalled outright war that would not only have happened between Tanzania and Uganda, but also would have dragged on other regional member states because countries had started aligning with either Tanzania or Uganda. So in that sense, Somalia saved the East African community. Although the community eventually broke apart in 1977, and you can see what happened because a year later, after the community broke apart, Tanzania and Uganda went to war. So Somalia gave us 5 more years of the East African community. With the community no longer in existence and whatever semblance of cooperation was left between Tanzania and Uganda broken down, the two went to war in 1978, which resulted in the eventual overthrow of President Idi Amin. So Somalia's role towards the East African community has been significant, and I hope that some of these examples, especially to the young Somalis in the audience today, give you the hope that this is familiar territory for you and that you're not strangers in this union and in this community. As I mentioned earlier, my journey here took 3 days. So to occupy myself, I bought a copy of the East African newspaper that came out over the weekend, and it had an interesting story. Somewhere, I think must have been page 6. The story said, Somalia moves closer to enjoying perks of joining EAC. And it detailed a recent meeting in Nairobi where Somalia sent a 25-man delegation to discuss the modalities of being fully integrated into the EAC. I think this is a significant step worth congratulating this country upon. And I think Somalia's entry into the East African community opens up several unlimited opportunities for the region to harness, especially the experience of your large diaspora that is spread across the world, and the unique skills that they bring into the community. Already the Somali diaspora in Uganda and Kenya plays a significant role in business, and in the case of Uganda, it's perhaps the largest African indigenous capitalist class in Uganda. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say this, that Somalia 52 years ago saved the old East African community from collapse. Its entry into the same community in 2024 might be the salvation that our vibrant but troubled EAC needs. Asante sana, Mungu ibariki Jumuiya ya Afrika Mashariki.